Greetings everyone. This is an earthquake watch for March 5, 6 and 7. A powerful G2 class geomagnetic storm was felt March the 1st. I do believe there is a strong likelihood of some potential large earthquakes during this watch period, perhaps one or two over 7.2 in magnitude. The GOES X-ray flux monitor is showing some activity, and this will more than likely prevent a large earthquake to occur during March 4. These activities are mainly due to the sunspots being in an Earth-facing position. I do believe that late March 4 to early March 5, once these sunspots move away from these positions, we should see a calming in X-ray activities, and this will more than likely give a green light for a large earthquake. Looking at the ACE dynamic telemetry, we get to see significant solar winds. Current levels are 610 km a second. Now these are fairly high, and they've remained so since the March 1st geomagnetic storm. So this is an indication that we are receiving a new coronal hole translation which may produce a very large earthquake. And once these levels do begin to subside, perhaps around about 350 km a second, the conditions may be ripe for a very large earthquake. The KP index has shown continued activities since the March 1st geomagnetic storm, and this was a fairly powerful storm, perhaps one of the largest since April and July 2010. I do feel that there is a strong likelihood that there will be a 3.5 to 4.5 day lead time before we feel the effects from these events. And I do feel that March 5 and 6 would be the most likely dates for these events to be occurring. Looking at the coronal hole information from solon.info, we get to see this fairly large coronal hole moving away from the Earth-facing position. Now this geomagnetic storm has perhaps disrupted or delayed these events from occurring. Now we did receive some events in and around 9 degrees north latitude, and that would indicate that we've already received that information. And we're starting to receive some in and around the 19 degrees that I forecasted in my last video. I do feel that there is an area about 28-29 degrees that may still be in play from this coronal hole, and then we'll have to look further on the solar corona for other coronal holes to determine where these other events may be. Okay, I'm going to be targeting some areas for this watch. I do feel that the southern hemisphere would be more at risk, mainly due to celestial influences and also with the coronal holes that are on the sun right now. There aren't many significant holes in the northern hemisphere worth looking at, so I do feel that the majority of large events may be in the southern hemisphere during this watch. The main area of concern is 30 to 35 degrees south latitude, and this is the coronal hole, and it's a fairly lateral, so we may be receiving sporadic events, perhaps a lot of 5.5s and 6s in and around this region, or a few very large events, so we need to closely monitor this. Now for the people in New Zealand, specifically Christchurch and Wellington, we can see towards the end of this watch, perhaps March 7 and 8, we may receive a smaller event in and around those regions, so we need to closely monitor the effects and the movement of these coronal holes. But I do feel that there is perhaps a potential of a 5.5 event or an aftershock for Christchurch, or maybe a larger than normal event for Wellington, and this does sit at around 43 degrees also, so we need to closely monitor this as well. Looking at the 193 angstrom with the SDO satellite, first off we'll have a look at the magnetic filament that ejected March the 1st and the instigator of this geomagnetic storm. Fairly powerful eruption. Now we do also see a solar tsunami effect shortly thereafter. Now we did receive a similar effect prior to the Christchurch earthquake, and this is also supported by a sunspot region directly behind. Now I'm looking directly behind this region, and we do have another coronal hole formation, and it is moving quite violently. I do feel that the large earthquake during this watch will be in this region. Now it is 18 degrees south latitude, and then it flares out, so we'll map this area right now. Okay, I'm going to be plotting some areas that I feel would be most at risk for a large earthquake, possibly 7.2 in magnitude during this watch. Now the coronal hole I have mapped as best I can, just to show the symmetry. We do have 18 degrees south latitude, and this is a fairly dangerous region here on Earth, as we do have Tonga, Fiji and Vanuatu, fairly seismically active, that fall into that latitude zone. Now the flaring on the solar corona indicates that Loyalty Islands would also be in play, and possibly the most at risk for a large event, as the coronal hole is moving considerably in that region. So I do feel that Loyalty Islands will be the most at risk, and I do expect there may be a strong likelihood of a large earthquake in one of these regions during this watch. Using the composite imagery with the SDO, we get to have a look at the coronal holes slightly more clearly. This is the area that I've just targeted and mapped. There's lots of discharging coming out of this coronal hole, which is quite unusual. So there's a fair amount of activity coming from this, and there's also another formation underneath that I'm concerned with. A new coronal hole is starting to open up 41 to 44 degrees south latitude, and this will put the areas of Christchurch at risk for an aftershock, and also the area of Wellington of a larger event than they have been receiving. So there's a possible event here in the making. Hopefully it's not too large. We can also see this solar tsunami effect spreading quite violently after the ejection of the filament. So there's a fair amount of movement here. You can actually see it is spreading quite rapidly, and this area may be producing one or two earthquakes in and around the scarring region left on the solar corona. I have received a fair amount of emails regarding some concern over New Zealand. I do believe that there is a potential of a 5.5 earthquake during this watch in and around Wellington or potentially Christchurch, so we need to closely monitor this region. I do feel that the coronal holes on the solar corona are slightly above, and that would indicate that Chile and Kermadec Islands or North Island New Zealand would also be at risk for another event. So we are seeing a fair amount of activity and a fair amount of potential of these fault lines coming into play during this watch. I'm going to be targeting this scarring region on the solar corona, and it is fairly lateral, 31 to 35 degrees south latitude, and then working its way lower as we progress during this watch. The areas most in play for this 31 to 35 degrees south latitude event would be Valparaiso-Chile, the Kermadec Islands and North Island, New Zealand, and the southwest Indian Ridge. Those will be the key areas that could be receiving one or two events during this watch. Okay, with this large coronal hole that's past the Earth facing position, we haven't really received anything from the rear portions of, and I do feel like there may be an event about 28 to 30 degrees north latitude, perhaps 6.0 to 6.2 in magnitude, that may be felt during this watch also. The most likely areas at risk for this Northern Hemisphere event would be southern Iran, a possible event in Pakistan, or in Sichuan, China. I do feel that this Northern Hemisphere event may be a land-based event. That's my earthquake watch for today, March 4, 2011. Annotations will be added as events occur, and also at the end of the video. Thanks for watching.